President Lee Jae Myung holds a press conference earlier on this Thursday, that is September 11th, to mark his first 100 days at the top office, taking questions from members of the local as well as foreign media. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Thursday, September 11th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. Today we mark the first 100 days of the Lee Jae Myung administration, and in light of this occasion, the President sat down with the press to share his thoughts on the economy, diplomacy and culture. For more on this, I have freelance journalist Raphael Rashid here in the studio. Raphael, it's great to have you here.
Great to be back.
I also have Thomas Maresca with the American news agency UPI with us as well. Thomas, welcome back.
Thanks, great to be here.
So, Raphael, you were there at the press conference with President Lee Jae Myung. Let's start with his remarks with regard to the economy.
Yeah, President Lee framed his first 100 days in power as primarily a period of recovery and normalization, with economic recovery as taking the absolute priority. He described Korea's economy as having been weakened recently due to extreme degree of prolonged domestic demand stagnation, requiring something that he called emergency CPR. The President also highlighted several concrete achievements over the past 100 days or so. So he said that consumer sentiment had recovered to its highest point in 7 years, 7 months, helped by swift implementation of the supplementary budget, which we all know resulted in the consumption vouchers that were distributed to the entire population, to the public. He noted that various economic indicators are now turning upward in a positive direction, pointing to the Kospi index, which he said, had surpassed, well, it did surpass 3,300 points to reach record high levels, at least before the press conference. And he emphasized that the financial markets and the stock market were showing rapid signs of recovery. So looking forward, the President outlined an ambitious vision for what he called genuine growth through building an innovative economy that leads the world alongside growth for everyone, basically ensuring that the fruits of economic expansion are shared by all citizens.
Raphael, what were some of your takeaways from his remarks?
Yeah, I think I'd say my takeaways are that I think Lee is positioning himself as a president who rescued or is rescuing Korea from economic crisis through immediate intervention. The emphasis on consumption vouchers and stimulus measures suggests that his administration views domestic consumption as a key driver of recovery. The focus on record-breaking market performance also proves kind of serves his political narrative that his presidency has restored confidence. However, the growth for everyone rhetoric that I just mentioned indicates awareness that any recovery must be felt broadly to be basically politically sustainable. So I think his political messaging or his economic messaging blends kind of crisis management with optimism, portraying that the worst times are over for Korea and promising transformation and growth going ahead.
Right, and for the sake of context, Thomas, what can you tell us about the current state of the Korean economy, and what are the challenges here at home and abroad?
Right, so I think you might characterize the economy in a kind of period of like a cautious recovery or maybe delicate sort of recovery. We have seen growth rebounding this past quarter, the second quarter of the year. The economy grew 0.7%, but that was after 4 quarters in a row of being kind of no growth or even negative. Bank of Korea and IMF is projecting like 0.8% growth for the rest of this year. And then I saw some figures from Bloomberg, a kind of roundup of projections for 1.8% next year and 2% in 2027. So, not explosive growth, but growth nonetheless, and certainly better than where we were. As Raphael mentioned, there's some indicators that are quite positive, like the Kospi index being kind of on fire. I think it's the best performing market in the world this year, actually. At the same time, there are a lot of uncertainties, and there's certainly domestic and international potential headwinds. I'm not an economist, but these are things that I've seen pointed out. We have seen consumer stimulus rebounding this year, partly by the result of the supplemental budget. But there's already, I think, some signs that it's weakening a bit. I mean, there's also been a big tech and AI investment that's helping sort of stimulate the economy, and that, I think AI remains a question mark, sort of, whether it's going to pan out, and globally, I think in the U.S. as well, there's some questions arising whether we're seeing a bit of a bubble with that. So that's an area maybe to keep an eye on. External factors, I think, are just a huge thing that they really are in such an unpredictable state. I mean, we've seen South Korea did strike this tariff and trade deal with the U.S. not so long ago that seemed relatively favorable, and compared to some other countries. And South Korea does have some advantages in its relationship with the U.S. in certain fields like shipbuilding, and semiconductors remain important. So you would think it's well positioned. South Korea may be well positioned to kind of weather this uncertainty, but then suddenly we've seen this deportation situation in the Georgia Hyundai plant, which kind of just is such a sort of a shocking and unexpected twist in this relationship. And Korea had been investing quite a bit in the U.S., so that sort of throws the balance off. And I think just even globally, we still really haven't felt the impact of tariffs and the whole sort of uncertainty around the future. And Korea, as such an export-driven economy, clearly is exposed to that. So it's a sort of a cop-out to say, like, we'll see, but I think we are in such a period when it's so hard to accurately sort of assess the future. But that said, for now, we are on this sort of cautious recovery path, I think.
Right, and keeping in mind what Thomas has just said, Raphael, where do trade talks between Seoul and Washington currently stand?
Yeah, the trade talks between the two sides have reached a kind of critical deadlock, with the negotiations stalled over the massive $350 billion investment fund that basically sits at the heart of their kind of bilateral agreement. Even the presidential policy secretary, Kim Yong-bom, has been, I guess, blunt about this situation, stating that we are, or at least they are, at an impasse right now. The core problem centers on foreign exchange concerns. Seoul argues that it cannot accept the same terms as Japan's $550 billion deal because Korea's economic fundamentals are essentially entirely different. They're not the same, they say. The Korean won lacks the international currency status of the Japanese yen. Korea's foreign exchange reserves are 3 times smaller than Japan's, and the $350 billion investment vastly exceeds Korea's state-run policy banks that they can procure annually, basically, which is said to be around $20 to $30 billion. There's also friction when it comes to the profit-sharing arrangement. So the U.S. Commerce Secretary, his assertion that 90% of profits from Korea's investment in the U.S. would go to American people. This has angered Seoul officials a bit, and they basically view these terms as unacceptable. And despite, I would say, reaching a framework agreement in July that reduced the tariffs that we saw from 25% to 15%, the two sides still lack this kind of formal documentation. Even the industry minister, I believe, is traveling to Washington. I think he departed this morning for emergency talks, marking, again, an escalation in this kind of diplomatic effort to get things running and get things running, because working level the negotiations have basically yielded minimal progress for the time being. President Lee this morning at the press conference made his negotiating position clear. he said that I will absolutely not make decisions that go against South Korea's national interests, and I will not engage in any negotiations that go beyond rationality and fairness. So I think this reflects his broader stance that Korea won't be pressured into any unfavorable agreements simply for the sake of reaching a deal.
Right, indeed. Thomas, the President also covered politics and foreign affairs in his press conference earlier today. Could you walk us through his thoughts?
Yes, well, it was he covered quite a bit. I mean, it was a very lengthy press conference, and a lot of the domestic political issues, I think he got very much in the weeds that I think maybe foreign press doesn't quite, fully absorb or get too in detail with generally in our coverage. But I mean, his overall stance politically, I mean, he kind of repeated his his main point, since the start of his administration, that he aims to achieve national unity and the political divide, and he sort of discussed his first 100 days as a kind of a period of recovery and normalization. He did address a lot of questions, and topics were about kind of contentious issues like the special prosecutor reform, prosecutorial reform, special investigations, media law, inheritance taxes, and I won't go too in depth on it, but he basically kind of tried to defend each case, I mean, certainly in terms of investigating the, martial law period, he was making a case that it was sort of the good of the people and not a politically motivated investigation. On the foreign policy front, I mean, he pretty much keyed on Japan, North Korea, and U.S. as his three main topics. I mean, he with Japan, he actually said that Korea-Japan relationships are as difficult as relations with North Korea. And he talked about the history and the territorial disputes with Japan, and didn't, he said he wouldn't ignore those topics, but wanted to just approach future-oriented issues, social, economic, private exchanges separately, and that's kind of where he's been from the start. Again, with this, he's really emphasized a kind of a pragmatism in his foreign policy. He kind of commented on the resignation of the Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba, and said that, acknowledged that could perhaps, add a new wrinkle to the relationship, but he said he plans to maintain the existing principles that, he met with Ishiba recently. He acknowledged North Korea. His attitude remains cold. He acknowledged these outreach efforts that his administration has made, but North Korea really has not responded at all. But he said, we're consistently continuing to make efforts, and he sort of stressed the importance of coordination with the U.S. I mean, he really gave kind of Washington the driver's seat role in whatever may happen as far as, future negotiations with North Korea, which, I don't think is incorrect, saying that Pyongyang kind of regards Washington as the main, threat / potential partner. I mean, that's the way it's been for quite a while. So, he said that North Korea would kind of play the role of like a pacemaker or pace setter in helping to set up if there's a summit with the U.S. So he was kind of giving the U.S. the sort of primary role in maybe what would happen in the next stage of any kind of negotiation with North Korea. But said, he would continue, his administration would continue just trying to create these efforts at keeping the peace, and maybe even a small opening will emerge. So he's been doing all these, lowering the temperature moves, like turning off the loudspeakers. And then, he spent time on the U.S. I think this is the big question, and maybe the takeaway that a lot of international media covered was his comments about this immigration raid at the Hyundai factory, and, mentioning that it would have probably, a negative impact on Korean investment unless there's some kind of, perhaps negotiation and changing the visa situation to avoid these. But he expressed puzzlement, bewilderment at such a thing. He also announced the return of the detainees. He was the one who announced the flight coming back. So, there's not really much a good way to spin how shocking this situation was, but I think he addressed it relatively forthrightly.
You're right. I was actually going to ask you about your takeaway from that press conference with regard to his thoughts on foreign affairs and politics, but you already covered that. So I'm going to give this next question to Raphael then. How do you evaluate President Lee Jae Myung's foreign policy thus far, Raphael?
Yeah, I guess bouncing off what Thomas has said, I mean, I think his foreign policy has represented a significant recalibration, at least compared to his predecessor's approach. And there's been a bit of a mix of I would say, early small achievements. So yeah, as Thomas was talking about, when we look at Japan, for instance, I do think there's been a relative breakthrough, especially by making Tokyo his first bilateral visit, breaking 6 decades of protocol, and Lee also secured this first joint statement between the two countries in 17 years. So I don't think we can say that that's not as, I think it's quite significant. And this wasn't just symbolism. The agreement on, there was hydrogen, artificial intelligence, cooperation, joint demographic solutions addressing real challenges that the two countries face. I think the personal chemistry that he had with, well, I guess now former Prime Minister Ishiba was noticeable. But I guess we'll have to see now that he has resigned. But I think today he also, in his press conference, mentioned that, regardless of whoever becomes the next leader, he will, it seems, still try to focus on maintaining this relationship. And definitely the presidential office has made that clear. It doesn't matter who will come in power. But I think the standout success, despite all the headlines and the noise, the standout has been his relationship management with Trump's America. Lee has successfully navigated what many feared would be a kind of disastrous mismatch when they met the other day at the White House, and the $350 billion trade framework, despite, of course, the current implementation challenges. I think it does represent a major diplomatic achievement in itself, that at least eliminated the immediate threat, the tariff threats, and I guess positioned Korea as a key partner for American industrial policy. That said, Lee's foreign policy, I think, does still face, of course, some limitations. I don't think it's going to be an easy ride going ahead. For example, China, despite sending envoys and kind of doing this kind of diplomatic outreach, the substantive progress remains elusive for the time being, I think. Of course, we saw the Speaker of the National Assembly, Woo Won-sik, going to Beijing the other day, so that was a positive sign. But Beijing's expectations for a major policy shift towards China, I think, hasn't materialized yet. Of course, we are only within 100 days, so he has a bit more time. But then we'll have Washington's pressure for alliance, burden sharing, and there will also be other factors. And again, coming back to what Thomas was talking about when it comes to North Korean dimension, I think that this probably presents his greatest challenge, despite these kind of confidence-building measures, turning off the loudspeaker broadcasts and prohibiting the leaflets at the border. Pyongyang has remained, as President Lee said, cold, or giving the cold shoulder at the moment, quite unresponsive. So I guess looking ahead, the real tests will be, we'll see Trump's demands for expanded U.S. forces Korea, strategic flexibility that's been covered on this program many times, potential defense spending increase to 3.8% of the GDP. And then again, the unresolved trade disagreements will, of course, challenge Lee's so-called balancing act, which has been, I think, successful for the past 100 days, but it doesn't mean it will be easy sailing going ahead. So overall, I think his early achievements, at least they provide a solid a relatively solid foundation for the time being, but kind of preserving a space for autonomous decision-making, I think, will be his biggest challenge to come.
Right. And with regard to North Korea, Thomas, as both you and Raphael have mentioned, the new administration has taken tangible steps to seek to reduce tensions here on the Korean Peninsula. But North Korea, for its part, as Raphael just said, it's been unresponsive, cold, so to speak. What are your thoughts with regard to the Lee Jae Myung administration's approach to Pyongyang?
Well, I think it's, it fits into his kind of overall, just this strategic realism that I think is marking his approach to the presidency. It really is just an approach at this point. It's not really a plan or anything, and so, but it is obviously it's a contrast to his predecessor in terms of, moving from kind of hostility to, pacification, or trying to sort of lower the temperature, I guess you could say. I mean, there's been some criticism, is he being too conciliatory, saying, he mentioned during his, the Liberation Day speech, respecting kind of the North Korean system. But, I think at the same time, he really is not taking an ideological approach as much as I think most previous administrations kind of have in the past, either really holding unification up as the ideal, or kind of maintaining this more war stance against them. Whereas I think he's trying to, in a sense, it is more addressing the reality, I think, of the situation now in a way where it's kind of impossible to pretend as much of we can, I mean, his approach towards denuclearization, even he's kind of announced a plan that was, seen not as hardline of a complete, CVID, complete verifiable denuclearization. You talked about a 3-step plan: freezing, reducing, dismantling, and that's already something that's a bit different in the framework of how this is being talked about. And again, it may not sort of satisfy extremes on either side, but there certainly has been a call for sort of trying to have a reasonable or realistic approach to negotiations with North Korea. And even something like freezing their nuclear program at this point could be seen as a win. There's been some studies recently saying that in X number of years, like a decade or so, if North Korea keeps building nuclear weapons at the certain pace it has, they'll have a bigger arsenal than India, Pakistan, Israel. So, we're at a different place even than the first Trump administration about like what we can hope to get from North Korea. But at the same time, as you've mentioned, we've all talked about, North Korea has been totally unresponsive to any of these overtures so far. So I guess the other question, what would, get it beyond the sense of an approach or a stance, is like, what can you do to bring North Korea maybe to the table to even start discussing it? Obviously Washington seems like the kind of focal point to get this started, but at the same time, we've seen so much unpredictability from Washington in this administration. It's hard to necessarily count on that, but there has to, obviously it is only 100 days as well, but eventually there has to be some sort of framework or some outreach that's to North Korea to try and get them to respond.
Right. Well, pundits are hoping that the upcoming APEC will provide the opportunity for a dialogue with North Korea. We'll see if that happens this autumn. All right, Thomas, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Raphael, thank you very much for your insights.
Pleasure, as always.
That ends this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow.